Today in Studio 4, we meet a retired airline pilot who is hooked on racing and breeding standard-bred horses. Horses he would rarely call jugheads. David Woolley comes off the farm to take us into the horse barn and to the harness racing track at Fraser Downs. And he is a reporter with an endless curiosity, and he is a committed nosy Parker who is always in search of people stories. Global's Mike McCardle tells us some more of his storybook tales that inspire us and tug on our heartstrings. And to begin the hour, Peter Kinch, a real estate entrepreneur and financing expert whose specialty is educating Canadians who are in search of a make-sense real estate purchase, comes in with some advice to help you keep on top of mortgage regulation changes. Stay tuned. To begin the year, the Bank of Canada has come up with some mortgage rule changes. Federal Finance Minister Jim Flaherty announced said changes on January 17th. And it is my pleasure to welcome mortgage broker entrepreneur Peter Kinch, the author of the Canadian Real Estate Action Plan, back to Studio 4 to give us his thoughts. Nice to see you again.
Oh, it's nice to be here again.
So, Bank of Canada, Mark Carney, and Federal Finance Minister Jim Flaherty get together. They're a little worried about household debt and make some changes.
Yeah, well, you know what, and it's interesting, Fanny, because I see there's so many different factors at play here. And one of the first things that Canadians need to understand is we hear these big headlines, mortgage rules change, but really it's CMHC. The only thing that Ottawa can control is CMHC. This is the Crown Corporation that provides mortgage default insurance for Canadians who have high ratio mortgages. So if you put less than 80, if you're buying a house with less than 80 or less than 20% down,
right, it
needs to be insured, okay? And that's where the Crown Corporation, CMHC, comes into play. But they're not the only insurer. There's also private insurers like Genworth and AIG. So when Ottawa says they're making rule changes, what they're doing is they're limiting what CMHC can do because that's controlled by the government. It doesn't mean it's affecting all mortgages in all areas.
Okay, so what has changed? What will change in March? Better question.
Yeah, and what's going to change, they came up with 3 rule changes. And interestingly enough, boy, 2011 is really starting to mirror 2010 because this is exactly what we came out with in January of 2010. Jim Flaherty announced 3 rule changes then as well. And it's because all the clatter and talk about housing bubbles, and we don't want to go down the path of reckless lending like we did in the United States. We don't want to have those results. So what they did is they came out and they made 3 rule changes. Number 1, they said we're going to change the maximum amortization from 35 years down to 30. And the second thing they said is...
Which means? Explain amortization.
Okay. So
I happen to own a house, so I know, but maybe everybody doesn't.
You might have a 5-year term on your mortgage, but you're allowed 30 to 35 years to pay that off. And the amortization is the length of time to which it takes you to pay off that mortgage. And when you make the amortization longer, then your payments go down. Now, people are lamenting, oh no, now it's going to be more expensive to buy a house. Well, time out, wait a second. The longer your amortization, yeah, the lower your payments, but the more interest you're paying over time. So what Carney's basically saying is, I don't want to see Bob and Mary in their 60s and 70s and they're still paying off their mortgage. We want to encourage Canadians to pay more on their mortgage and create equity so they're not reliant on old age pension.
Right, but we can do that on our own. If we have a windfall and we decide to pay down our mortgage, we can. Nobody says you can't put more money on your mortgage, do they?
Absolutely. You can at any point. You know, banks allow you prepayment privileges, so you can arbitrarily reduce your amortization. And if you look at statistics, majority of Canadians have their amortizations are way less than 35 years. But if you're a first-time home buyer, especially in Vancouver, hey, anything that makes it less expensive to get into that home, makes it more affordable, that's great. Interestingly enough, we're all kind of like, oh no, now they've cut back. Well, it was only 2006, Fanny, that Canadians only had the option of 25-year amortizations. And then when that period between, remember that period between 2004 and 2007 when the market was going up like crazy and everybody's getting excited and the Americans are letting you do anything you want? Well, Canada got into that kind of boat, and then said, well, let's go from 25 all the way up to 40 years.
That was in 2008. You could get 40 years, 0 down.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So now they kind of peeled it back. It's like a parent saying, well, I took away your curfew and you abused it, so now I'm going to reimpose a curfew. But it used to be 9 o'clock, now it's 11. Oh, now the kids are all upset because my curfew's back in place.
Okay, so that's row one, amortization changes, only 30 years.
Yes.
What's 2?
Number 2 was the bank, or the Ottawa basically said, we don't want to see Canadians refinancing their homes right up to 90% anymore. And again, it used to be 95, now they cut it back to 90. Last year they cut it back to 90. This year they've now cut it back to 85%. Now this doesn't mean you can't refinance your house.
Right.
It means Ottawa doesn't want to be providing insurance for Canadians refinancing and taking all the equity out of their house. So think of it this way. Let's say, again, Bob and Mary own their home. The tendency was Canadians were saying, wow, historically low interest rates. I'm going to go and take some equity out. Well, the problem was they weren't doing that to reinvest and buy real estate on average. Statistics say that Canadians were starting to use their house as an ATM machine. The majority of those high ratio refinances were used for better cars, travel, big screen TVs, boats. And it was interesting, Jim Flaherty's comments said, we as a government do not want to be seen as insuring or supporting that behavior. So
household debt is rising on the back of your home equity line of credit, so to speak.
Well, and of course, what we in the mortgage industry are saying, hey, wait a second. The real problem here is credit card debts are out of control. When we talk about, you've probably seen about the debt to income ratios are like 148%, and now they're saying Canadians are taking on more debt to income compared to the United States. And this is an issue, but I'm not so sure that attacking the mortgage rules was the right avenue. I think maybe we should have. Who's controlling the credit card debt out there?
Okay, exactly. But why would somebody second mortgage their home rather than just going to the bank and getting a line of credit if you want to go to France?
It's cheaper. If you have a line of credit that's a personal line of credit, say I just want to get a line of credit unsecured, you're going to pay prime plus 3 or 4.
Okay.
If you have it secured against your home equity, the bank gives you a lower rate.
Right, unless you're a billionaire and then they give you better rates.
Possibly.
It's always been the way, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, the wealth effect. We really look richer than we are. Is that what you're saying? The country looks richer than we are?
Well, in some cases. I mean, I think what the term that keeps coming out is prudence. And the other third rule, by the way, was home equity lines of credit. The government no longer wants to ensure the ability for Canadians to take home equity lines of credit out, which really is similar to the refinance. Rules 2 and 3 really blend. They're attacking the same target.
But what's the difference between a second mortgage and a home equity line of credit?
Well, a home equity line of credit is essentially a second mortgage. It's when you're taking the equity out in some form of a line of credit secured against the home and it's registered as a second mortgage. The rule number 2 was they don't want you to refinance. So if you have a mortgage and you've got 30% equity, hey, why don't we access all that equity and get a new first mortgage? And so in both cases, bottom line is, Jim Flaherty and Ottawa are basically saying, we do not want to see, here's what they don't want, it's optics, Fanny. They don't want headlines in the papers to say that Bob and Mary were foreclosed on because they accessed all the equity in their house and a Crown Corporation provided insurance, endorsed it. So.
Right, but their headline reads, what day was it, January 18, tighter mortgage rules announced by federal government hit BC hardest.
Absolutely.
Why?
Because, go figure, prices here are the most expensive in the country.
Okay.
So if you're a first-time home buyer, if we actually dig a little deeper, it probably says those new rules impact Vancouver at the hardest.
Sure.
Because let's think of it. The average typical young first-time home buyer today is looking to try to get into this marketplace. There's no question. This is a very expensive marketplace, hard to get into for a young couple today.
Even if you're buying a closet in the West End?
Absolutely. So clearly we have the most expensive real estate in the country. So clearly any advantage you have to be able to extend your amortization to make those payments more affordable is an advantage to get into the market. So this is the market where that will be impacted the most.
Okay, if you do the math, you find by some miracle a $300,000 house, or maybe we should say a condo. And under the new rules, How much more would it cost you a month with the new amortization? Or
it's a great question. In fact, I actually did the numbers on that, and it works out to be roughly $100 a month on a $300,000 mortgage today. Now, the question that Ottawa would say is, you know, if that $100 makes a difference, maybe you shouldn't have gotten into that house in the first place. They're trying, what Ottawa's trying to do is they're targeting the fringe. They're not targeting the average Canadian. They're trying to go after the fringe. Who are the people who are stretching their budgets, who could be the vulnerable borrowers in our marketplace? And those are the people who, if a 35-year amortization changes your payments by $100, and that's enough to break you, well then maybe you should reconsider what you're buying. And again, those who are accessing equity in their homes because, oh, interest rates are cheap, I'll go buy boats and TVs now using my home as an ATM machine. What are you going to do when rates rise? And that's where Ottawa is strategically targeting those fringe players. So
as a mortgage broker, if you do take out a second mortgage, where should you put the money? In another property? Is that a good plan? A rec property, a recreational property, just a plot somewhere?
Well, when I'm coaching or consulting clients, what I like to see is I have no problem with people using equity if they're using it to create wealth. And you know what? There's a lot of Canadians who probably should be looking at the equity in their homes and saying, there's a good opportunity for me to leverage some of my equity and create some better wealth. And that would be by buying assets, whether it's stocks, bonds, gold, or real estate.
Well, we know the Ferrari loses value the minute you drive it off the lot. So the Ferrari's out. But say you find an apartment building on a nice corner with tenants, and it's a commercial property. Good idea to, and I shouldn't say jeopardize, but use your family dwelling as a down payment or...
Yeah, well, using your family dwelling can be a very solid strategic avenue, a strategic vehicle. The thing is, what I would say is, don't speculate with that. Do some research so you know what you're doing. Ideally, whatever you purchase with that home equity, make sure that the tenant, and whatever tenant, whether it's a business or a renter, make sure that the rent they pay will cover the mortgage costs, including servicing your line of credit, so it's not impacting your family budget.
Exactly. What about a Whistler property, a Squamish property, a Gulf Island property?
It's a really good point, but you know what? The majority of people who do that do it for a lifestyle, and they confuse investing and lifestyle choice. And we see that in the States right now. People say, oh, it's a good time to buy in the States. Well, really, are you doing it for a lifestyle choice, or are you doing it to get a cash return on your investment? Because if it's for investment, there are a lot better places to utilize your funds than Whistler, the Gulf Islands, or the United States right now.
But if you are an aging boomer and plan eventually to retire somewhere, it would seem to me, just logically, it's a good time to buy south of the border down Mexico way. Yay, nay?
Well, I would really caution people right now, because here's my personal opinion, that if you are planning to move there, if that is part of your lifestyle plan, then securing that retirement or lifestyle plan today is as good a time as any. But if that's not your plan and you're just buying it because it's cheap, and I heard somebody else made some money, it's a good time to buy down there, I would strongly caution against that, because there's a whole wave of hurt still coming on the United States side.
Sure.
And the property you buy today could be the best deal somebody buys off you next year.
But we are all people of shoulda, woulda, coulda.
Yeah.
And how many of us have said 100 times, you know, 20 years ago, I could have bought a place in Hawaii for 50 grand.
Absolutely.
My friends did. And it's now worth $500,000. So it's that pinch factor. You think, when should I dive in? What question should I ask myself before I dive in to a second home, a second property, a condo I plan to flip?
The biggest question you ask yourself is why you're doing it in the first place. What end result are you trying to accomplish? In my book, I talk about starting with the end in mind. And if you identify what that end result looks like, that will actually create the clarity as to what your investment has to produce for you. Far too many people go out there and buy something not